Michael was born in 1791 in England, and he grew up very poor, one of many, many children to a father and mother who didn't have a lot. So when he was 14, they apprenticed him to a bookbinder, and though he knew not much, he did at least know how to read. So in his spare time at the bookbinding business, he would read and read many, many books and became self-taught. He read one book by Isaac Watts, the minister and hymn writer, called The Improvement of the Mind. And he used a lot of those principles, not just to learn, but to learn how to learn and to learn how to think. He married at the age of 30 and went to work as a scientist. He'd made a friend with a man named Dyer, and this man Dyer was not able to go to all these scientific seminars, but would send Michael to go to these seminars, and Michael would take all these copious notes. In fact, once he sent back notes that were 300 pages of notes that he'd written at these lectures, and just gained all this knowledge, started to work with Dyer, and then sort of just worked his way up the ranks, eventually landing at Oxford. This man invented the Bunsen burner prototype, the one that was used later on by so many other scientists, and with that then was able to isolate certain gases and metals. Finally, this young scientist, Michael, discovered that you could generate electricity with a magnet. Before that, they did not know how to generate it, and he made the first transformer, changing society forever. This man, of course, if you know this, is Michael Faraday. He was a devout believer in Christ, and he was someone who loved the Lord and used all of his understanding of the natural world and his love of God to explore all of what God had made, especially in the area of metal and magnets and electricity. He said once, "The book of nature which we have to read is written by the finger of God." When he looked at nature all around, when he saw all these things, electrons and everything to discover, he saw everywhere the finger of God, and that made him excited for scientific research. Michael used the knowledge of God's order to further discovery. And it's interesting that so many scientists today use this thirst for knowledge in order to disbelieve God. How is it that two people looking at the same data set can come to such different conclusions? Well, it starts with how you look at God. If you, like Michael Faraday, look at God as the creator and the sustainer, the one who wrote the laws of physics, then you're going to approach science very differently. But if you're looking to disprove God, then you're going to find all these natural processes that you're just going to say happened and appeared. We don't know where they came from. So we're thinking about God. And Job and his friends had ideas about God while observing the facts. The facts of Job's disaster, the fact that he lost everything in a single day, and the fact that he went from being a rich, respected, prestigious man to being someone with nothing and diseased. While they had back and forth ideas throughout the book of Job, and if you've been here through most of it, you understand what I'm talking about when I say that, he sometimes charged God with being either too rigid or apathetic or ignorant or unkind. And we've seen that throughout, just this balance of how do we take what we have seen in life and make interpretations about God from it. Elihu tried to speak on God's behalf, and he did really well. The last words he said there in verse 23 was touching the Almighty. We cannot find him out. He is excellent in power and in judgment, and in plenty of justice he will not afflict. But now God shows up, and God speaks for himself. And now there isn't going to be banter about who God is and what he's doing. It's God himself that shows up at the very end of the book to set the record straight. Well, I should say, it would be nice if he set the record straight. He never actually says to Job why everything happened, and he never tells us. That's, I think, a very good reason for us to read this book. The fact that sometimes God doesn't give us the answer of why, the temporal why, but God still speaks. In chapter 38, so first of all, he shows up and he demands that Job answer for himself. Notice in verse number 1, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Throughout the book of Job, Job has said, I wish I could go before God and I'd demand an answer from him. And now God shows up in a whirlwind and says, I'm actually going to demand of you. Who is this that darkens counsel, who tries to shade my knowledge with words, ignorant words that you don't know anything about? And so God is not pleased with everything that Job has said. He'll give him a chance to repent. We'll see this throughout the next couple chapters. But he reveals then how much he knows about things and uses that to show Job and us how little we know about things. That's the thrust of the last few chapters here. And I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to go through chapter 38 tonight. But God speaks here in chapter 38 of 5 categories of his knowledge. We're actually only going to go through 4 because the last one really bleeds into chapter 39. And so just for tonight, 5 categories of his knowledge. Now remember, this is poetry. The very first message I did in the book of Job was about a year ago, was about how Job is poetry. And so we can't just take it as, well, why doesn't God just say it like that? Well, he does, but it's in a poetic sense, and you just have to know that going into it. Okay? In these 5 categories, again, he reveals how little we know about the world around us. And the point is, how can we hope to understand what God is doing when there are so many other things about the world we just don't understand? How can you demand an answer? I would understand. You explain it to me. I'll get it. And God says, would you? Because there's so much about this world that you don't already understand. So much that you already don't have any control over. So it speaks of who God is. First of all, we see in verses 4 through 7, the questioning that revolves around the foundation of the earth or the creation of the earth. Verse number 4, where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare, if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. He says, where were you, Job? This is speaking of God's eternality. God created the earth many, many years before Job came around. And God says, I was there when the foundations went down. But Job, you're speaking as if you were there too, and you weren't. You weren't there when the foundations of the earth were laid. Genesis 1 begins with the earth already established. God did that long ago. But God had created the earth on nothing. There was no starting place. Job had already acknowledged this in Job 26, verse 7. He stretched out the north over the empty place and hangeth the earth upon nothing. In verse number 7, he says, the angels were there to sing for joy as I created the earth. But Job, you weren't there. You didn't observe any of this. You never heard the singing and the shouts of creation coming together. And this speaks to the fact that God begins things from nothing. God, if you think about this, never reacts to anything. God investigates or instigates. He starts things. Do you know that most of our laws that we have are because somebody did something? Have you ever heard of a law and you're like, I wonder what happened to get that law written, right? Dan, I'm sure that you think about this all the time. Who did what to have this written in the code book, right? Zach, same thing. Why is this law written? We're trying to get this done and there's this law and who did what to get that? Russ, when you worked, why is this a company policy? Somebody did something. We always react. We're always just trying to play catch up. And that's never with God. He never reacts to anything. He never has to add. He never has to change. He never has to say, oh, what am I going to do about that? He instigates. Michael Faraday had to climb on the shoulders of those who had gone before him. He didn't discover that electricity existed. He didn't discover the power of magnets. He took those lectures and those scientists that he worked with, and he had to build on their knowledge. That's the way science works. Again, he went to scientific lectures and he took all these notes, and we too have to adapt at what life throws at us because we're ones who are always trying to play catch up. Job has to find out, okay, what does this mean for me? And what God is saying when he says, I laid the foundations of the earth, is I was there from the beginning. I start things. I don't have to try to find out what's going on. God is the beginner of things when we go through trials. And so we can know that God knows what he's doing. He's laying the foundation, even today, for future endeavors. Right? What you are going through now is possibly laying a foundation for something that God's going to do in your life later. And you may not like it, and you may not really understand it. You may wish there was a different way, but do you trust that God, starting from the beginning, knows what he's doing? He was there. He's the instigator. He's the starter. So trust him. The second category is questioning the power of the oceans. In verse number 8, or who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth, as if it had issued out of the womb? When I made the cloud the garment thereof, and the thick darkness a swaddling band for it, and he brake up for it my decreed place, and set bars and doors, and said, hitherto shalt thou come, but no further, and here shall thy proud waves be stayed. What he's saying is this: when the ocean does whatever it wants, and the oceans are massively powerful, there's very little that can withstand it. We were in Duluth a few years ago, and if you've been to Duluth, you go into the harbor there, and you see this kind of thing sticking out of the water, and you think, oh, that's interesting. What? Because it's way out there, but it's not a rock. It's like a piece of cement, and it looks like, you think, well, maybe it's a boat that kind of sank into the harbor or something. What is that? Well, back in 1919, a man named Harvey Whitney started to build this hopper conveyor system. He thought, well, if I have these pylons, I can go out into the harbor, and rather than going under the bridge and into this other harbor, I can just have ships come into this little bay, and then I can just have a little conveyor, and then I can just get stuff off of the ship there. He tried for 3 years to get that thing built, and he went up against Lake Superior, and guess what? Lake Superior won. It's called Harvey's Mausoleum there. You can go see it today as long as you can, because, there was a lot more there not that long ago, and it's just being kind of slowly eroded. Now, that's just one lake, one freshwater lake in one place, and a pretty innocuous place in one place in Minnesota. Think about the oceans. I read a book somewhat recent, a few years ago, where it was talking about how dangerous sea travel used to be in the early 19th century, and how are there these 100-foot waves that would just be all over the ocean. And if one of those things hit you, even today, you're not going anywhere. You're not doing anything about it. You build the best boat you can, and you are just at the mercy of the sea. We build seawalls to hold it back, and they still disintegrate quickly. It's just water. Well, yes, but it's the greatest dissolvent that God's made. God decrees where those waters stop on shore. God says, I put bars and holds, and I say, this is as far as you're coming. And when God says it, guess what? The ocean says, okay. God has absolute power over the thing that back in those days, especially Job, if they went out there and this is just this big mystery, it's a dangerous thing, it's not something I even want to try. The fishermen back in Jesus' day would be scared to go into the Sea of Galilee, which was just a lake. How much more the ocean? And here's God saying, I control all of this. And this speaks to the power of God over the most powerful things. You know that there's nothing beyond God's power. There's nothing that can stay or stop him. And again, this is something that Job had already affirmed. In Job 26:8, he bindeth up the waters in his thick clouds, and the cloud is not rent under them. Electricity back in Faraday's time was thought to be uncontrollable. You could only be a victim of it. When it struck you, then you knew it existed. But wouldn't it be nice to harness this power? And there was just no way that anyone knew how to do something like that. It was still volatile, but Faraday was able to learn how to harness it, and that has changed everything. Just think about how much of a leap we were able to make because we were able to harness electricity by how much we can do with it. Michael Faraday said this, quote, "The beauty of electricity or any other force is not that the power is mysterious and unexpected, touching every sense at unawares in turn, but that it is under law, and that the taught intellect can even now govern it largely." He says everything is under control of a law, and Faraday knew who the lawgiver was. Electricity isn't this random thing. No, it goes by laws. That was the basis of science. If I can find out what law this is under, I know that it has to stay here and control. And of course, electricity, we have, bounds. Now we know how to put bounds on it so it can't go here. None of us are worried about getting electrocuted by those lights up in the because there's so many different things that we know about it, right? We've learned how to harness it. And that's the same thing with God. One of the greatest powers on earth is love. And God's love is greater than all those powers. God's love is greater than even the love that we can experience and know. And he promised in Romans 8:35, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword?" God's love is what sustained Jonah when he was in the sea. It's what sustained the disciples when they were in the sea. God's love is more powerful than anything. And if you are an object of God's love, then guess what? There's not much. There's nothing that can come after you with any success beyond the power of a heavenly Father. Nothing is beyond God's power to help save. He's never helpless. Then we have questioning about the order of the world. In verse number 12, he says, well, actually, let me just go through this. God set the world to run as a clock. It turns consistently. This is what scientists call the conservation of angular momentum, meaning that the earth goes at the same rate. That's why, it's never going to be, unfortunately, that January 19th is an 80-degree day and that August, fortunately, is ever going to be a negative 20, because it's always cold in January because the earth turns at the same time and about the same time every year. That's the way it goes. And you say, well, that's the way we set it up with a calendar. Yes, but it's not like some years are 400 days and some years are 100 days. It may feel like that at times, but that's not the way it goes. We all understand we're about the same place every year, and there's a consistency to it, and it's always been that way. The earth is slowing a little bit. I think it's like 0.00001 mile per hour every century or something like that. So we are slowing down a little bit, but negligible. And so he says in verse number 18, "Hast thou perceived the breadth of the earth? Declare if thou knowest it all." Do you know how big the earth is? Now, scientists figured that out later, but to Job, he's saying, I know exactly to the inch. And scientists can say, well, it's about this many miles around. We look at Jupiter, we say, it's about this many miles around. Sure it is. Sure it is. How close are you with those measurements, right? God knows exactly how many. He knows how many hair's breadths the earth is around, right? So this is not hard for God. In verse number 12, he talks about the day spring. "Hast thou commanded the morning since thy days, and caused the day spring to know his place," or the dawn? Meaning this, do you know how to make the sun come up at a certain time and go down at a certain time? Sometimes wouldn't it be nice if the sun just came up a little bit earlier, just on one day? Peter, wouldn't it be nice to have like an extra hour of work? Not all the time, but just like this one day. It'd be nice if the sun came up just a little bit early, just like an hour earlier. Yeah, but you know what you can do about that? Exactly nothing. And God's saying, Job, do you know how to make that happen? No, God does. Remember Joshua? Stand still in the sky. And it did, under God's command. God knows how to do that. In verses 13 and 15, he says, and when I do that, when I make the sun come up in the morning and all the wicked are, oh no, the sun's up and now what we're doing is being discovered by others. He said, God doesn't get credit for that. God doesn't get thanks for bringing the sun up on the wicked so that they're not always in darkness. Verse 13, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth, that the wicked might be shaken out of it. Verse 15, and from the wicked their light is withholden, and the high arm shall be broken. He says, I'm in control of all of that, the way the sun goes, the way the light comes in. Verse 14, he says, when the sun appears, it changes the way the landscape appears. And again, this is very poetic language. It is turned, in verse 14, as clay to the seal, and they stand as a garment. The idea there So what they would do back then, they had these cylinders, and maybe you've seen these if you've done like wallpaper or something, but they have these like rollers and you have a little pattern on it and you put it either in, maybe you have Play-Doh or something, but you have these cylinders and you roll it out either on a piece of paper to paint it or on a piece of clay, and it would kind of make these patterns on it. And that's what they would do with these cylinders. They would put this on and it would kind of be a seal. And that's what he's talking about. It's like the sun. You ever seen that? You're in some place where you can watch the sun just kind of move across a landscape and it changes the way it looks. That's what he's talking about here. God says, can you make it do that? Can you make the sun just kind of sweep across? Can you make those clouds move so it looks different in different lighting? You can't. I know how to do all that. That's my job. That's what I do. He says in verse 16 that God brings forth water from deep water spouts. This is an amazing thing. Scientists are looking for water on Mars because they assume that water had to come from some other place in the universe. And then in 2017, these scientists came up with, you know what? It seems like water is actually being generated from the earth, from the mantle of the earth. It's already here, and it's just kind of being pushed out from below. Who knew that? Well, God did. In verse number 16, hast thou entered into the springs of the sea, or hast thou walked in search of the depth? Well, no. You know, they say we know more about the surface of the moon than we do the ocean floor. We're still trying to explore what's going on in the ocean floor. And God's asking Job, do you know what's down there? I wonder, so if the Bible says in Revelation that there's no more sea, I wonder, does that mean there's not going to be all the water that we have on the earth now? Like, are we going to be able to live in places that are now under the ocean? I don't know that to be a fact, but if the Bible says no more sea, I wonder where all those people, all the saved people are going to inhabit the earth one day. But one day we'll get to have all the secrets. God sees it all now. Stuff that's at the bottom of the ocean, God sees all of that. It's a pretty amazing thing. And here's Job trying to figure out what God's doing. And God says, you just don't know. You just don't. He says in verse 17, have the gates of death been opened unto thee? Or hast thou seen the doors of the shadow of death? Hast thou perceived the breadth of the earth? Declare if thou knowest it all. Where is the way where light dwelleth? As for darkness, where is the place thereof? That thou shouldest take it to the bound thereof, and that thou shouldest know the paths to the house thereof. Knowest thou it because thou wast then born, or because the number of thy days is great? And obviously, there's a little sarcasm here. The answer is no. Job doesn't know any of this because the number, he might be around for 500 years. 500 years in comparison to a millennia, what is that? What is it in comparison to a millennium? It's nothing. So this speaks to the order and wisdom of God. Nothing happens without God's ordinance. He knows what he's doing, and he is ordered in all that he does. One of the arguments for the existence of God that some apologists use when they're on college campuses. You can't go into a college campus and say, thus says the Bible. I mean, you can, but it's just not going to hit some people. And so apologists will go on and they'll do lectures and they'll talk about how to prove that there is a God, at the very least that there is a God, just from logic and science. And one of the arguments that they use is the fine-tuning argument, meaning this, that Earth is just right for life. We're just the right distance from the sun. We're at just the right tilt. We have just the right atmosphere, just the right amount of nitrogen, just the right amount of oxygen, just the right amount of water. The moon is just the right distance away from us for life to flourish. And the only argument that anyone has ever made against the fine-tune argument is the multiverse theory. Well, there's probably billions or trillions of Earths, and we just happen to be on the one that has life. Well, okay. If that's the argument you want to make, a multiverse, then fine. But we haven't found any planets that are even close. That's a good argument for the existence of God. And God uses this here to say, I'm an ordered God. Everything is just how it should be. Michael Faraday operated on the idea that there were laws, that it wasn't all random. He said this, the laws of nature as we understand them are the foundation of our knowledge in natural things. And he continued to observe, and Michael Faraday, back in, listen, the 19th century, actually is one of the people that discovered nanoparticles. All the quantum mechanics that have come from, that we understand now, that people are getting into now, all of that started with Michael Faraday. Because he understood God is a God of order. And he knows what he's talking about. And all these things that we're seeing, there's much more to this because God is ordered. If you start there, if you don't think that we're just a collection of random molecules kind of thrown together, intelligent primates who have somehow evolved so that we can look into electronic microscopes, then maybe you'll be able to find something out because you realize that there's order to it. God's order shows that he's full of wisdom and he sees the sequence that needs to happen. God doesn't owe you the explanation of the sequence, but do you know that it's there, that there's a logic and a reason to what God is doing? The fourth category then is questioning the things concerning the weather or the heavens. God's work in the wonders of the heavens. He talks about in the use of weather. Verse 22, hast thou entered into the treasures of the snow, or hast thou seen the treasures of the hail, which I have reserved against the time of trouble, against the day of battle and war? By what way is the light parted, which scattereth the east wind upon the earth? These are weather things. And he says, do you know how to throw hailstones on soldiers? I do. Do you know how to overthrow armies with rain and wind and hail? I do. Do you have any control over that at all? No, I do. He talks about the use of the water cycle in verse 25. Who hath divided a water course for the overflowing of waters, or a way for the lightning of thunder, to cause it to rain in the earth where no man is, on the wilderness wherein there is no man, to satisfy the desolate and waste ground, and to cause the bud of the tender herb to spring forth? Hath the rain a father? Or who hath begotten the drops of dew? Out of whose womb came the ice and the hoary frost of heaven? Who hath gendered it? The waters are hid as with a stone, and the face of the deep is frozen. People in the desert want rain, and you know how they get it? If I say so. People in another place, they don't want any more rain. You know how they get rid of it? If I say so. And I make the water go up, and I make it frozen here. It's a little colder there. And God is in control of all of that. Even in the stars, look at verse 31. Canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Go out tonight and you can look at Orion and say, yeah, God knows what he's doing with all of this. Verse 32, canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth in his season, or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? Knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? Canst thou set the dominion thereof and the earth? You know that scientists today, because of the order of the way that we're moving through the universe, they can tell you what the night sky looked like back in the first century. I mean, take any century, they can wind the clock back and they can tell you exactly what the night sky looked like, what these ancient peoples were looking at. Why? Because there's order to it. Because God has made it in such a way where everything is just so. And then he talks about the weather in general. Verse 34, canst thou lift up thy voice to the clouds, that abundance of waters may cover thee? Can you cry out to this, I want rain, and it'll do anything? No. Verse 35, canst thou send lightnings, that they may go and say unto thee, here we are? Inward parts, or who hath given understanding to the heart? Who can number the clouds in wisdom? Or who can stay the bottles of heaven when the dust groweth into hardness and the clods cleave fast together? The answer, of course, is God. God's the only one that could do that. Job has zero power over any of that. This speaks of God's control over all the moving parts of the earth. Do you know that God is never doing one thing at any time? He's always doing multiple things. And in your life, it may seem like God is either squashing you, or God is punishing you. But do you know that God is doing more than one thing at that time? He's maybe growing you. He's maybe punishing someone else. He's maybe bringing someone else to a greater understanding of who he is through your suffering. Remember, we talked about this last week, but Paul said, well, if that's the case, then I guess I'll keep suffering because God knows what he's doing. And maybe by mine suffering, someone else, because God is always doing something else. He's not just doing one thing. And this is proved, again, by all the stars and the heaven. And when he puts rain here and not rain here, God knows all of that and he knows what he's doing. God is never doing one thing. God is at work in hearts. Those are his and those that are not his. I believe fully that God is drawing everybody to themselves. Some will not. They will not respond. They will resist, and they will resist until they die and are eternally separated from him. But some will come to him. God is always drawing everyone. And even those of us who are his, he's still drawing you to himself. He can keep everything going at the same time. Faraday became very recognized for what he was doing. And the queen offered him a knightship. And he turned it down. He said, I don't want that to be in the way of me helping and studying. I don't want to be known as sir. He was a humble man. He realized there were great limits to his knowledge and to his work. He once said, a man who is certain he is right is almost sure to be wrong. As a scientist, you don't find that kind of humility anymore. People write papers and they say, oh, this is settled science. You chumps just got to listen to what I have to say, and that's the end of it. Well, and then you find out that they're wrong. This fish that they're trying to protect, and then I find out that, oh yeah, it's just a normal fish that we get all the time. Oh, this thing that we were trying to protect in this wetland, well, it's not actually there anymore or whatever. There's always this science is so sure of everything, and God says, but I know, and you don't. God's control over all the parts shows his vast sovereignty more than we can realize. What do we learn about God from a passage like this? Not just that he's all-powerful and not just that we're not, but that God knows what he's doing and that he has wisdom. And you think about all the things that God has to do to keep everything going just normally, all the stuff we have no idea. I think all of eternity, we're going to just praise God and be amazed at all that God has to do. Every electron, every proton, every star, everything just right where it needs to be. Everything moving just in the right way that it has to be. What an amazing thing. There are much that Job and his friends didn't understand about what God is doing, and we can say we don't either. But if we could admit that there's much that we don't know about what we can see, like the stars, and we're going to look at later the peacocks and the lions and the wild goats and things like that. But if we could admit there's a lot we don't know about the things that we can see, then it's not a far step to admit there's a lot that we don't know about the things that we can't see. That should deepen our faith. Not in, again, the process. You got to trust the process. Nope. You got to trust the person. That deepens our faith, not in the process, but in the person. I'll leave you with one last quote from Michael Faraday. The Bible and it alone, with nothing added to it, nor taken away from it by man, is the sole and sufficient guide for each individual at all times and in all circumstances.